Released in 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog quickly rose to fame as the flagship game for the Sega Genesis game console. A side-scrolling platformer, its music was composed by J-pop musician Masato Nakamura. Nakamura faced various constraints in composing Sonic's music, including restriction of 4 concurrent sounds. Wanting to match the mood of the gameplay experience, Nakamura stated, "I composed melodies that kept the game tempo in mind without sounding unnatural. I also wanted to make sure that the music didn't lose its groove. After all, one of Sonic's key elements lies in speed." This desire to not sound unnatural and retain the groove is a key element of many game music songs. However, Sonic is an interesting example because of how it manipulates irregularity. In this video, I will discuss how Sonic's irregularities help to create anticipation and expectation within 3 framing sections of the original Sonic game: the title theme, the continue menu, and the game over screen. In this analysis, I will briefly discuss 3 musical features that affect expectation and resolution: phrase structure, harmony, and melodic line. A few basic theoretical assumptions and methodologies will help to frame this analysis. First, to analyze phrase structure, I will use the grouping structure methodology of William Kaplan, as presented in classical form. Although Sonic is clearly not a work from the classical era, Kaplan's strategies for grouping motive and phrase at the smallest scale are general enough to provide us with useful tools for understanding the structure of modern music. Components such as the basic idea, that is, the initial melodic motive, contrasting idea, and cadential idea will be used here. Expectation and regularity will also be discussed. 2 assumptions will prove useful for this discussion. First, as David Huron describes in his book Sweet Anticipation, many Western-based musics have a preference for binary divisions. Huron first discusses this in terms of beat grouping and subdivisions, but consequently expands the idea to include larger-scale formal structures such as phrase. The consequence of this preference for binary divisions is that we generally expect a regular phrase length to be a binary-based length of 2, 4, 8, or 16 measures. Second, the listener will extrapolate predictability or regularity through familiar patterns. Therefore, irregularities can be perceived as normal depending on context. As Huron describes, listeners have little difficulty predicting non-periodic event patterns, as long as the patterns are familiar. Harmonically, this analysis will mix a few styles of chord and key analysis. The basic framework employed will be standard Roman numeral analysis. However, Alan Moore's article, The So-Called Flattened Seventh in Rock, will inform my interpretation of harmonic function and cadence. Moore states that rock has its own harmonic paradigms, and that these can range between a minimal divergence from classical style to a complete divergence. He specifically identifies that, for both of these extremes, one fundamental site of this separate identity is the frequent absence of a diatonic scalic leading note, due to its frequent employment of mode rather than major-minor tonality. As a result, the progression flat 7-1 forms a standard diatonic progression in this repertoire, one that often acts in a cadential role. The linear bass motion to 1 creates the cadential paradigm. Lastly, a few standard assumptions from tonal music will be employed. That motion by semitone creates tension and a sense of resolution, that dissonance creates instability, and that a gogic accent, or in other words, a note of longer duration, will suggest a moment of repose or what I'll call rhythmic cadence. Let's begin by examining Sonic's title theme. Observe the following features. It is an irregular meter, 4/4, supported by consistently spaced offbeat percussion attacks, with the exception of a shift to an on-beat note at the moment of cadential arrival in measure 3. Its motivic content begins with 2 statements of a basic idea, which is very regular. The repetition of the basic idea helps to reinforce that this is the main theme of the game. The second basic idea varies from the first in its second half. The harmonic progression remains the same, but the lowered scale degree 7 occurs in the 2 melodic lines now rather than in the bass. Contrasting material occurs in the 3rd measure, and there is no distinctive melodic or rhythmic content in the 4th measure since it only contains a held bass note. This creates a mild irregularity of phrase length. We would normally expect a cadential arrival in the 4th measure in a standard phrase, but here it occurs 1 measure early, suggesting a compression. Its harmonic content features a repeating 1 to major 7 progression using the lower 7th scale degree. But in measure 3, G sharp is used instead of G natural, creating tension and resolution through semitone motion to the final cadential arrival. This is strengthened by the alteration of B to B sharp, which creates an additional semitone resolution to C sharp. Other interesting features include the octave leap in the bass and change of register, which create a sense of finality through a common cadential bass pattern. And lastly, a change of rhythm in the 3rd measure brings in the 5th note of the melodic pattern earlier than expected. heightening anticipation of its more stable arrival point on the next beat. A similar syncopation occurs in the bass on the next beat. The music of the Continue menu is based off the same theme but introduces chromaticism and polytonality that disrupt the original theme's stability. The one-measure basic idea of the title theme recurs in the first measure. The song ends with the one-measure idea that reverses the melodic contour, but retains a very similar rhythm to the basic idea. In consecutive measures, this basic idea is repeatedly transposed out by semitone in the melody and bass, while its counter melody remains fixed in A major. As a result, by the end of the fourth measure, 3 different keys occur simultaneously to create a jarring dissonance that the player can only resolve by making a choice to continue or to quit the game. The 2-beat anacrusis features descending chromatic movement, which mirrors the subsequent chromatic ascent in the melody and bass lines. Unlike the title theme, the length is now more regular at 4 measures. In spite of this, it sounds much more irregular than the previous version. Why is this the case? One element is likely the syncopation that ends each reiteration of the basic idea. While the syncopations in measures 1 to 3 resolve to a stable downbeat in the counter melody and bass at the start of the next measure, after measure 4, no such strong beat attack is heard. Second, in the title theme, a displacement of the percussion offbeat rhythm created an on-beat attack at the cadential arrival. No such displacement occurs here to suggest an ending. Third, there is no shift to a contrasting idea or a Gajic accent in the melody to suggest an ending. Rather, the music's 4-fold repetition and lack of tonal or rhythmic stability suggest a desire for continuation. This is not inappropriate given that the Continue menu itself is prompting the player to begin the game anew. The implication is that the game does not want an ending to occur. Finally, let us examine the game over theme, another variation of the title theme. It begins with the same basic idea and repetition that was originally heard in the title theme, but now at a significantly slower speed. To emphasize this, the percussion part is much sparser, augmenting the original pattern by 2 and removing the fill. There is also a change to the contrasting idea. Rather than the original ascending leaps from the title theme, we now hear a new lament motive, a descending chromatic line. The song ends with a longer duration, a half note, suggesting a more conclusive ending than the music of the previous Continue menu. This is further emphasized through an exaggerated vibrato on the final note. However, this half-note ending is harmonically unstable given that it lands on F sharp and G sharp, a major second dissonance. This produces not only a sense of ending, but also a sense of disappointment for the player that the gameplay is coming to a close. The lack of harmonic and melodic resolution, as well as a move away from the A major tonality through chromatic motion, suggests a lack of fulfillment. The slowing of both the overall tempo and the percussion dissipates musical energy, as does the omission of percussion within the final lament motive. In conclusion, even though each of the 3 iterations of the title theme feature musical irregularities, all 3 examples feature adjustments to their phrase structure, tonality, texture, and tempo that make them optimally suited for each of their respective roles throughout the game. Musical irregularity and stability, rather than sounding unnatural, adds to the player's sense of anticipation, continuation, and conclusion as the game progresses. Nakamura has successfully balanced game tempo, naturality, and mood.